The sound of ice hitting the bottom of a glass is ordinary, mundane even. But on that summer night in 1975, in Howard County, Maryland, it marked the beginning of a story that would haunt investigators for half a century. Somewhere between the laughter, the jukebox, and the lingering smoke of a busy bar, 26-year-old Roseann Sturtz made a choice that seemed harmless. She trusted someone. She wasn't reckless. Friends knew her as careful, polite, not the sort to drift into dangerous company. Yet the irony of true crime is that victims are often punished not for carelessness, but for believing, even briefly, in someone else's humanity. That night, Roseann leaned over the bar, smiled at a man, and ordered another drink. Witnesses would later recall that he seemed charming. They couldn't remember what he was wearing, but they remembered how he made her laugh. The details are fuzzy. Alcohol has a way of dulling sharp edges, both for those drinking and those observing. But one detail remained sharp in every witness's mind: Roseann left the bar with him. That moment, the door swinging shut behind them, was the last time anyone saw her alive. The following morning, Howard County woke up to whispers. It was unusual, in a community so small and tight-knit, for someone to vanish overnight. Parents reminded their daughters not to walk alone. Bartenders replayed the evening in their minds, wondering if they had missed a warning sign. Some locals dismissed it. She probably stayed at a friend's place. Others, perhaps more cynical, muttered, "Women who go home with strangers invite trouble." The word stung, even then, and they would echo for decades as victim-blaming crept like a shadow over Roseann's memory. Her body was found not long after. Strangled. Left discarded, as if her life were disposable. The brutality of it shocked even seasoned officers. She had bruises on her neck, signs of a violent struggle. The medical examiner was blunt: this was not a crime of passion, not a lover's quarrel gone wrong. This was domination, control, and silencing. But even in death, Roseann seemed to defy silence. Her murder rattled the county. Newspapers carried the story with bold headlines: "Young woman strangled after night out." Yet as dramatic as the coverage was, the investigation behind the scenes was clumsy. Detectives had suspects. Oh, they had plenty. Every man she had spoken to at the bar was hauled in for questioning. Some were married, which sparked a mini-scandal. One man, a local official's son, was rumored to have been seen close to her that night. He swore it wasn't him, and the authorities, perhaps eager to protect certain reputations, seemed to take his word too quickly. Roseann's family was devastated. They had to live not only with her loss but with the whispers of a community eager to move on. Small towns often prefer forgetting. But her mother would not let the memory fade. She clipped every newspaper article, kept every police update, and, in a detail that would later prove prophetic, she recorded every conversation she had with investigators on a cheap cassette recorder. Those tapes gathered dust for decades. They were meant only as a grieving mother's shield against the fog of memory, but they would become the beating heart of the case nearly 50 years later. For now, though, in 1975, the case cooled almost immediately. Investigators had no DNA technology, no digital forensics, no internet databases. A witness's memory was their only tool, and memories are fragile things. Witnesses argued about the color of the man's shirt, the kind of car he drove, whether he had dark hair or light. A composite sketch was drawn and quickly dismissed. Leads fizzled. And so, Roseann's name slipped quietly into the files marked unsolved. But even unsolved cases have aftershocks. Whispers grew into rumors, that the killer was someone powerful, that evidence had been lost, that certain names had been deliberately scrubbed from the suspect list. The controversy only deepened when one detective abruptly requested a transfer. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, neighbors whispered that he knew the investigation was compromised. The scandal should have fueled outrage. Instead, it smoldered in silence. The 1970s were not kind to women who demanded justice, especially those who were accused, however unfairly, of courting their own danger. Howard County turned the page, but Roseann's family never did. Her mother's cassettes, her father's sleepless nights, her siblings' unease walking alone at night, these were the living reminders of a wound that would not close. The case would remain dormant for years. Detectives retired, evidence boxes gathered dust in police basements. What no one knew was that one day, those same dusty boxes and those fragile old cassette tapes would resurface, shaking loose secrets that the killer surely believed were buried forever. The night Roseann walked out of that bar, the killer thought he had silenced her. But in truth, her voice was only waiting, waiting for technology, waiting for persistence, waiting for history to catch up. And when it did, nearly half a century later, Howard County would discover that the past never really dies. The call came just after dawn. A jogger, breathless and trembling, reported what he thought was a bundle of discarded clothing near a wooded patch along a quiet Howard County road. But clothing does not bruise. Clothing does not bleed. When officers arrived, the sight that met them confirmed every parent's nightmare. It was Roseann. She lay partially covered by leaves and twigs, as if someone had made a pitiful attempt to hide her but couldn't be bothered to finish the job. The morning sun was still low, slicing through the trees in cruel, narrow beams that illuminated her pale skin. The medical examiner's team arrived quickly, documenting every angle. She was fully clothed, but her blouse was torn. Her neck bore unmistakable marks, dark, furious impressions left by hands that had squeezed until life was extinguished. The officers at the scene exchanged glances, some stoic, some visibly shaken. For a rural county accustomed to burglaries and bar fights, the brutal murder of a young woman was almost cinematic in its horror. This was not Baltimore or Washington. This was farmland, diners, Sunday services. And now, suddenly, it was a crime scene that looked like something out of a pulp thriller. By midday, word had spread. Reporters, hungry for detail, crowded near the yellow tape. The local paper framed it as a tragedy that defied explanation. But among residents, explanations sprouted quickly, each one more scandalous than the last. Some swore they knew the man she left the bar with. Others insisted the police were covering for someone connected. One whispered theory even named the son of a county councilman, who had been seen drinking heavily that same night. Inside the cramped Howard County Police headquarters, detectives faced the agonizing first 48 hours. They canvassed the bar again, scribbling down names, reconstructing the timeline. Roseann had arrived just after 9 p.m., ordered 2 drinks, spoken with friends. She wasn't a regular, but she wasn't a stranger either. Several patrons remembered her chatting with a tall man. Details varied wildly after that. Dark hair? Or sandy? A beard? Or clean-shaven? A light jacket? Or no jacket at all? Memory, in the chaos of neon lights and alcohol, is a dangerous thing. The autopsy delivered a chilling confirmation: death by manual strangulation. No rope, no wire, just human hands. The examiner estimated she died sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., a narrow window that, infuriatingly, overlapped with when witnesses lost track of her. There was no sign of sexual assault, but there were defensive wounds. Scratches on her killer's hands would have told the story, if only the killer had been found. Roseann's parents were called in to identify her body. The silence in that room was unbearable. Her mother wept softly, clutching her rosary. Her father clenched his fists, his face turning an ashen gray. They were ordinary people, now dragged into extraordinary grief. And almost instantly, they sensed the first hints of what would torment them for decades: hesitation. Officials muttered about lack of evidence, about not jumping to conclusions. There was already a reluctance in their voices, as if the case were too heavy to lift. But outside that sterile morgue, the public demanded answers. Neighbors whispered over fences, church congregations prayed, and young women changed their routines. Don't walk alone, mothers instructed. Don't trust a man you've just met. Howard County, for the first time, felt unsafe. Detectives interrogated everyone they could tie to Roseann. Some of the questioning bordered on farcical. Married men swore they barely spoke to her, though bartenders remembered otherwise. One man, sweating under the fluorescent lights, admitted he'd offered her a ride but insisted she declined. Another grew angry, accusing the police of harassment. A third, notably connected to a county politician, was questioned briefly and then released. It was whispered that his father had made a phone call. And so the first hints of scandal began. Was this truly about lack of evidence, or about protecting someone's reputation? As days turned to weeks, investigators leaned on routine tactics: door-to-door questioning, polygraphs, handwriting samples. Yet the case moved like a car stuck in mud, wheels spinning, no progress. Each dead end deepened the family's despair. Reporters, once eager, turned their focus elsewhere. In the newsroom hierarchy, an unsolved murder slowly slid beneath headlines about politics, sports, and national events. But in the Sturtz household, the case never faded. Roseann's mother clung to every detail, scribbling notes in the margins of newspapers. Her father built a box to hold every scrap of information. At night, her mother replayed the conversations she had with police on a small cassette recorder, her voice pleading for updates. It was not an official investigation tool, it was grief captured on magnetic tape. Yet those tapes would become a time capsule, an accidental archive of negligence, missed opportunities, and half-truths. For now, though, they were just background noise to a grieving family. By the end of 1975, the case had already cooled. There were no new suspects, no new leads. Roseann's friends moved on, some marrying, some leaving town. But the empty chair at her family's table remained. Every holiday, every birthday, her absence echoed. And then there was the photograph. It surfaced in whispers, long before it became official evidence. Someone claimed a picture existed, snapped casually in the bar that night, showing Roseann with a man whose face was half turned from the camera. The picture was dismissed, passed around, then forgotten. "It's nothing," detectives said. But decades later, that same photo would resurface with haunting clarity, becoming the visual proof that investigators once ignored. If there was a conspiracy to bury the case, the photo and the tapes would one day drag it back into the light. But in 1975, Howard County turned the page. Life resumed. The bar stayed open, the road stayed quiet, and the killer walked free, blending back into ordinary life as if nothing had happened. Roseann's story could have ended there, in silence. But the past, as it so often does, was merely waiting. A murder leaves more than a crime scene. It leaves ripples, the kind that bend reality in strange directions. In Howard County, 1975, the ripples from Roseann Sturtz's death twisted into a web of gossip, fear, and scandal. The bar where she was last seen became the centerpiece of the town's whispers. Patrons remembered things differently. Some swore they saw her laughing at a joke from a man in a brown jacket, others insisted he wore a black leather coat. A waitress claimed she recognized him as a regular, but her statement was dismissed when it conflicted with another witness. Slowly, those contradictions took on a life of their own. People no longer asked who killed Roseann, they debated which version of the truth they preferred. The Sturtz family watched in horror as their daughter's murder became a kind of town gossip column. "They're saying she was drunk," one neighbor whispered. "She wasn't drunk," her mother snapped. "They're saying she flirted with him," another added. "What does that matter?" her father demanded. Victim blaming became a quiet undercurrent. A woman who left a bar with a man, well, what did she expect? It was a cruel reflection of the times, when women were taught not to get themselves into trouble rather than men being taught not to inflict it. The police never said this aloud, but their slow walking of the case spoke volumes. The most scandalous rumor, however, came not from idle townsfolk but from within the investigation itself. A patrol officer, speaking to a friend after too many drinks, let slip that one of the men questioned had powerful connections. "We were told to leave it alone," he muttered. The friend repeated it, the story grew, and suddenly, Howard County found itself buzzing with the possibility that the killer was being protected. The suspect in question was whispered to be the son of a county councilman, a man who had been drinking at the same bar that night. He was known for his temper and his fondness for young women. He fit the general description, but his alibi, thin as paper, was accepted by detectives with shocking ease. Some swore he had scratches on his hands in the days following the murder. He said they were from working on his car. The story was swallowed whole. To the Sturtz family, the possibility that the case was deliberately buried was unthinkable, but also unavoidable. They weren't conspiracy theorists. They were grieving parents who watched leads evaporate whenever certain names came up. Every time her mother pressed investigators, she received polite but hollow assurances, "We're doing everything we can." But the tone was wrong. It was the tone of someone trying to close a door. The tapes, those little cassettes Roseann's mother recorded, captured all of this. In one, she can be heard asking, her voice shaking, "Why did you stop asking about him? He was with her that night." The detective's reply is muffled, dismissive. "We checked him out, ma'am. He's not our guy." But there was no explanation, no evidence cited, no reason given. Just dismissal. Meanwhile, rumors outside the family grew wilder. Some said the killer wasn't local at all, that he was a drifter passing through. Others whispered it was a jealous ex-boyfriend. A few even suggested Roseann's friends knew more than they admitted, a cruel insinuation that fractured relationships for years. At the same time, Howard County was changing. The 1970s brought development, new housing projects, and new political ambitions. The last thing local leaders wanted was a scandal tying the murder of a young woman to a politician's family. Silence became convenient. And silence, in small towns, spreads faster than truth. But silence couldn't smother grief. Roseann's siblings grew up in its shadow. They carried the whispers with them to school, to church, to jobs. That's the girl whose sister was killed, people said. Her death wasn't just a tragedy, it became their family identity. Her mother grew sharper, more persistent, calling the police so often that officers sighed when they recognized her voice. "She'll never let this go," one said. He was right. Yet behind closed doors, the investigation was withering. Detectives rotated in and out, some retiring, others promoted, most leaving the Sturtz file untouched. By 1977, it was a cold case in everything but name. No one said it aloud, but the implication was clear: Roseann had been forgotten. Still, the gossip lingered. At the bar, older patrons warned newcomers about the night the Sturtz girl vanished. At church, women prayed for justice, but their prayers carried a note of resignation, as though they no longer believed it would come. The councilman's son eventually moved away, but his shadow never left. Some swore they saw guilt in his eyes every time her name was mentioned. Others argued he was innocent, unfairly smeared. The debate kept the scandal alive. And then there was the photograph, the mysterious snapshot said to have been taken in the bar that night. A young woman with a Polaroid camera had been snapping pictures for fun, selling them for $1 each. One picture supposedly showed Roseann in the corner, smiling faintly, with a man's arm draped casually near her chair. His face was turned, blurred, but not unrecognizable. Some said it was the councilman's son. Others disagreed. The photo was never officially logged into evidence. It vanished. Was it lost? Misplaced? Or deliberately hidden? For the Sturtz family, these questions were knives that twisted deeper with every year. It wasn't just that they had lost Roseann. It was that the system designed to protect her had shrugged and walked away. By the early 1980s, the murder was barely mentioned outside the family's home. Howard County grew busier, newer, shinier. But for those who remembered, the scandal never truly died. It lingered like smoke, thin, acrid, impossible to pin down. Some believed the truth had been buried with her. Others believed the truth was walking free, shaking hands, attending dinners, living comfortably. And somewhere, perhaps in a drawer, perhaps in a shoebox, a photo and a cassette tape lay waiting, artifacts that refused to let the past stay buried. The killer believed he had silenced Roseann forever. But in a way, the rumors kept her alive. Every whispered name, every half-remembered detail, every scandal that refused to fade, they were embers waiting for oxygen. And one day, decades later, they would ignite. By 1978, 3 years after Roseann Sturtz's murder, the case file was already dusty. A thick binder of interviews, sketches, and police memos sat in the Howard County evidence room, its weight measured not in pages but in failures. Detectives still claimed the case was active, but in truth, the energy had drained from it. Leads had been followed into oblivion. Witnesses recanted or contradicted themselves. Suspects faded back into their lives. The family knew what that meant. To them, active was a bureaucratic synonym for abandoned. One officer, privately recorded on Roseann's mother's cassette tape, confessed it outright, "We don't have enough to move forward, ma'am. Without new evidence, this case is going nowhere." His voice was weary, but also relieved, as though closing the book gave him permission to stop thinking about it. For the Sturtz family, it was salt in the wound. The frustration mounted when, in 1980, another strangulation case occurred in nearby Baltimore. It bore striking similarities: manual strangulation, body left in a semi-secluded area. Roseann's family demanded investigators consider a link. They were told politely that the cases were unrelated. No explanation was offered. Years later, independent journalists would question whether that dismissal was premature. Meanwhile, life marched cruelly forward. Roseann's siblings graduated, married, moved into adulthood with a phantom always present. Her parents aged under the burden of grief. Every family photograph had a missing figure. Every holiday carried the same empty chair. Yet her mother never gave up. She continued to write letters to police chiefs, state officials, even governors. She cataloged every rumor she heard, from drunken confessions to whispered bar stories. Some were ridiculous. Others sounded chillingly plausible. She documented them all. Her cassette tapes captured her relentless pursuit, conversations with reluctant detectives, late-night reflections, even prayers whispered into the microphone. By the mid-1980s, technology had advanced. DNA profiling had been pioneered in the UK. Across America, cold cases were beginning to stir back to life. But not Roseann's. When her mother asked about testing evidence, she was told, "We don't have the resources." That phrase, clinical, detached, became the family's new torment. There were also rumors of mishandling. Evidence boxes supposedly went missing. The mysterious photograph of Roseann at the bar, already spoken of in whispers, was nowhere in the file. Detectives claimed it had never existed, though several patrons swore they had seen it. "It's gossip," one officer snapped when asked. But gossip doesn't vanish from evidence rooms. Paper does. By the 1990s, Howard County was booming. New developments replaced farmland. The old bar where Roseann was last seen had changed owners, then names. Young people filled its booths, unaware of the tragedy once tied to its walls. For them, 1975 was ancient history. For Roseann's family, it was yesterday. The Sturtz parents grew older, frilier, their fight fueled by habit as much as hope. Roseann's mother, though, held on to her cassettes with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. She believed, almost prophetically, that one day they would matter. "These are the truth," she told her children. "When the police forget, the truth will still be here." And yet, scandal lingered in hushed tones. The councilman's son, once whispered as a prime suspect, moved out of state. Decades later, whenever he returned for family visits, old neighbors still muttered, "That's him," some said, watching him at church or the grocery store. Others defended him, calling the accusation slander. The truth was buried under years of silence, but the doubt never left. Meanwhile, the justice system carried on, indifferent. Detectives retired. Boxes were transferred from one evidence room to another. In the shuffle, crucial context was lost. Younger investigators barely knew the case existed. It was an old murder, a ghost buried in paperwork. In the 2000s, cold case units across the country began breathing life into long-forgotten files. Families saw miracles, killers identified decades later through DNA, confessions extracted from aging suspects haunted by guilt. The Sturtz family's hopes flickered again. They contacted police repeatedly, urging them to retest the evidence. They received nods, promises, polite emails, and then, silence. But beneath that silence, two things were waiting. First, the photo. Long dismissed, long rumored, it had never been formally catalogued. But whispers persisted that it still existed in a private drawer, far from official files. A young detective, years later, would stumble across a faded copy in an old journalist's archive. The blurred man beside Roseann would reignite everything. Second, the cassette tapes. Still stacked neatly in shoeboxes, still preserving conversations no one had paid attention to in the 1970s. One recording in particular contained a detective muttering a name, followed by the words, "But we can't touch him." For decades, no one outside the family had heard it. When investigators finally did, nearly 50 years later, it was like a time bomb exploding. But in the decades between, all the Sturtz family could do was endure. They watched anniversaries pass with no news. They saw television specials on other cold cases, while Roseann's name never appeared. They attended memorial services, clutching photos of a young woman forever frozen in time. Every year, Roseann's mother repeated the same line, "He thinks he got away with it." But the truth waits. It always waits. The killer believed he had buried the past. Howard County believed it had moved on. But beneath the dust of forgotten files, under the weight of bureaucratic neglect, the seeds of justice remained. They only needed someone, someday, to dig them up. And when that day finally came, it would not just reopen a case. It would reopen a scandal. By the early 2000s, the name Roseann Sturtz had become a faint echo in Howard County's collective memory. New residents had no idea that a young woman had been strangled after leaving a bar in 1975. The old-timers, those who remembered, spoke of it only in murmurs, usually prefaced with, "Do you remember that poor girl?" But while the town let the story fade, one household never did. Roseann's mother, now frail but unbroken, still kept her shoeboxes of cassette tapes stacked neatly in her living room. She had outlived the detectives, the politicians, even some of the suspects. But she had not outlived her determination. If the police won't remember, she told her children, then we will. Her foresight, recording every conversation she had with investigators, seemed eccentric at the time. In the 1970s, it was unusual, even paranoid, for a grieving mother to document police calls. But in the 2000s, when cold cases were being reopened across the country thanks to new forensic tools, those cassettes became priceless artifacts. They were not only a record of grief, they were a record of negligence, half-truths, and corruption. It began with a young detective named Daniel Mercer. He was assigned to the county's fledgling cold case unit in 2004. Mercer had a reputation for being obsessive, the sort of investigator who hated the phrase unsolvable. When he pulled the Sturtz file from the shelf, he was shocked at what he saw: pages of contradictions, missing evidence, and a glaring absence of follow-up. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to a colleague. "It's like someone wanted this case to rot." Mercer reached out to the family, expecting little more than weary resignation. Instead, he was handed the shoeboxes. At first, he thought it was sentimental clutter. But when he pressed play on one of the tapes, his skepticism vanished. The voice of Roseann's mother crackled through the speaker, tired, grieving, determined. And then came the detectives' voices. Men long retired, or dead, revealing, in careless words, the underbelly of the investigation. On one tape, a detective admitted, "We had a strong suspect, but we can't touch him. His father would ruin us." Another tape captured a dismissive laugh, followed by the words, "She shouldn't have left the bar with him. What did she expect?" Mercer froze. This wasn't gossip. This was evidence. He played the tapes for his supervisors. Their reaction was mixed, part disbelief, part discomfort. One senior officer warned him, "Careful where you dig, Mercer. Some of those names still carry weight." But Mercer wasn't easily dissuaded. He believed the tapes were not only damning, they were the key to reigniting the case. And then came the twist. One tape, recorded just days after the murder, captured Roseann's mother pressing a detective about the photograph, the one whispered about for decades. "You have that picture, don't you? The one from the bar?" she asked. There was a pause, then the detective's muffled reply, "It's better if you don't ask about that again." That phrase hit Mercer like a thunderclap. A photo. Proof that Roseann had been seen with a man. Proof that her mother's memory was not failing. But where was it? The hunt for the missing photograph began. Mercer scoured the evidence room, flipping through dusty files, hoping for a Polaroid tucked between reports. Nothing. He contacted retired detectives. Most claimed ignorance. One laughed nervously and hung up the phone. Another swore the photo never existed, even though multiple witnesses had described it. The more Mercer pushed, the more resistance he met. Doors closed. Calls went unanswered. But then, in 2006, a journalist named Carla Whitfield reached out to the Sturtz family. She was researching unsolved crimes for a feature series. When Mercer met with her, she casually mentioned something extraordinary. "You know, I think I saw that picture once. In an old newsroom archive." Together, they dug. And there it was, in a yellowed envelope, buried in a stack of forgotten clippings, a faded Polaroid. The image was grainy, the lighting poor, but there was no mistaking Roseann's face. Sitting beside her was a man whose profile was half-turned. His arm rested lazily on the back of her chair, as though staking a claim. His smile was faint, almost smug. The photo was a ghost resurrected. Mercer compared it to old DMV records. The resemblance to the councilman's son, long shielded by whispers, was uncanny. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was enough to rattle the silence that had smothered the case for decades. Still, Mercer faced obstacles. The county's legal team balked at pursuing someone so well-connected, especially based on tapes and a grainy photo. "We can't build a case on rumors," they argued. But Mercer knew better. Rumors, in this case, had always been reality, just ignored. Meanwhile, the Sturtz family's emotions surged between hope and exhaustion. After nearly 30 years, could this finally be the break? Or was it just another cruel cycle of raised expectations and shattered promises? Roseann's siblings, now middle-aged, sat with Mercer in their kitchen, listening to the cassettes play. "I can't believe they said this," one whispered, shaking their head. "All these years, and they lied to us." The discovery of the tapes and the photograph did more than reopen a case. It reopened a wound for Howard County itself. For the first time in decades, newspapers carried Roseann's name again. But now, the tone was different. It wasn't just about a victim, it was about a possible cover-up. The scandal simmered. People began to ask dangerous questions. Who protected the suspect? How much did the police know? And why had the evidence vanished? For Mercer, the tapes were both a gift and a curse. They gave him direction, but they also placed a target on his back. He was warned more than once to leave the past in the past. But he couldn't. The past, he told his wife one night, isn't gone. It's just waiting to be heard. And so, nearly 30 years after Roseann was silenced, her mother's voice, preserved on cheap magnetic tape, was speaking again. Speaking of injustice, of negligence, of truth. And the killer, whoever he was, had reason to be afraid. Because this time, the silence was cracking. The Polaroid was small, faded, its colors washed into sepia by time. But for Detective Daniel Mercer, it might as well have been a thunderclap in a silent sky. There was Roseann, smiling faintly, her body angled toward the camera, eyes caught mid-blink. Beside her sat a man with his head turned just enough to hide in the blur of motion. Yet his posture was intimate, possessive. His hand rested on the back of her chair like a silent claim. The photograph was not a rumor anymore. It was real. Mercer pinned a copy to his office board, staring at it for hours. He compared it to old driver's license photos, employment badges, and even yearbook pictures. The resemblance to the councilman's son, long shielded by whispers, was striking. The jawline, the sloping brow, even the faint scar near his temple, it was all there. The problem was that resemblance wasn't proof. And Mercer knew the county was reluctant to dig up old skeletons, especially ones that might implicate the powerful. The tapes were damning in their own right, officers dismissing leads, hinting at untouchable suspects, but in court, they were just voices on brittle cassettes. The photograph, though, was visual. And in the world of evidence, a picture was harder to deny. So Mercer pushed. He tracked down the woman who had taken the photo that night, a former waitress who had been dabbling with a Polaroid camera for extra cash. She was living in Florida now, gray-haired but sharp-eyed. When Mercer showed her the photo, her face paled. "I remember that night," she whispered. "I sold that picture for $1. Never thought it would matter." "Who bought it?" Mercer asked. She hesitated, then answered, "Her mother. She begged me for it, after they found Roseann." And just like that, the timeline shifted. The photo had existed in the family's possession, had been handed to detectives, and had then disappeared into a bureaucratic void. Or perhaps not a void at all. Perhaps someone had made sure it disappeared. When Mercer cross-referenced old evidence logs, the photo was nowhere to be found. No mention, no reference, no catalog number. As if it had never existed. But there it was now, undeniable. A ghost the system had tried to bury, resurrected by persistence and luck. Then came the turning point, DNA. The technology that had been unavailable in 1975 was now standard practice. Mercer petitioned for the testing of old evidence, Roseann's blouse, preserved in an evidence box. It took months of legal wrangling, but eventually the swabs were processed. The results stunned everyone. There was male DNA on the fabric. It was partial, degraded after decades, but it was enough for a preliminary comparison. When run through Cody's, there was no direct match. But it did trigger a familial hit, someone distantly related to the councilman's family. For Mercer, this was no coincidence. The photo and the DNA were converging on the same name, the same family, the same shadow that had hung over the case for nearly 50 years. The news leaked, as such things often do. A reporter hinted in print that a political dynasty in Howard County may be tied to an unsolved 1975 murder. The article didn't name names, but everyone knew who it meant. Overnight, whispers became shouts. Old neighbors dug out their memories. People recalled scratches on the suspect's hands. Others remembered him leaving town abruptly, only to reappear years later, untouchable. The scandal that Howard County had buried for decades burst into daylight. But controversy cuts both ways. Supporters of the councilman's family cried foul, calling it a witch hunt. "You're accusing a man based on a fuzzy photo and some old tapes?" one commentator scoffed. "This is politics, not justice." The county divided sharply, between those who demanded accountability and those who insisted the past should stay buried. Mercer didn't care about politics. He cared about Roseann. But even he had moments of doubt. The case was fragile. The DNA was partial. The photo was blurred. The tapes were informal. Could this really hold up in court? And then, in an almost cinematic twist, another photo surfaced. A retired journalist cleaning out his basement found an envelope of unused negatives from the 1970s. Among them was a clearer shot of the same night, same bar, same table. Roseann again, this time mid-laugh. And beside her, the man's face was turned just a fraction more. Enough to recognize him without doubt. It was him. The councilman's son, grinning faintly, seated comfortably with the young woman who would be dead within hours. The discovery hit like a hammer. Suddenly, the blurred rumor became an undeniable image. Suddenly, the scandal wasn't whisper but fact. And suddenly, the killer, who had lived freely for decades, was no longer a ghost. The county braced for impact. Old politicians held their breath. Retired detectives scrambled to explain themselves. And the Sturtz family, after decades of grief, felt the first tremor of justice approaching. But justice delayed is rarely clean. Nearly 50 years had passed. Statutes of limitations didn't apply to murder, but witnesses had aged, memories had faded, evidence had thinned. And most dangerously, the suspect himself had lived long enough to build a respectable life, family, career, influence. To accuse him now was to shatter not just his life but the illusion of the county itself. The photograph had survived. The tapes had spoken. But would anyone have the courage to act? As Howard County wrestled with its conscience, the answer crept closer. And in 2024, after decades of silence, the truth would finally explode into daylight. By 2024, Howard County was a very different place than it had been in 1975. The bar where Roseann Sturtz had last been seen was long gone, replaced by a sterile strip mall. The farms and backroads where people once whispered about the councilman's son had given way to subdivisions and traffic lights. Yet beneath the suburban gloss, the county still carried its buried truth. Detective Daniel Mercer, older now, gray at the temples, hadn't let go. Neither had Roseann's family. With the tapes digitized, the Polaroids authenticated, and partial DNA pointing toward a powerful bloodline, the case was no longer a ghost story. It was a legal landmine. In January 2024, Mercer submitted a formal request to reopen the investigation with the state's attorney. What followed was a storm behind closed doors, meetings, debates, and heated exchanges about whether the county could withstand the scandal of prosecuting one of its most prominent families. But DNA science had advanced again, and a new round of testing using forensic genealogy pushed the case into dangerous new territory. The degraded sample from Roseann's blouse was compared against genealogical databases. Slowly, a family tree emerged. And at the root of that tree was one name, the councilman's son, now in his 70s, living quietly in a nearby county. It was him. The knock on his door in March 2024 was the sound of half a century collapsing. Officers in plain clothes escorted him into custody as neighbors stared, jaws slack. Reporters swarmed within hours. Respected community leader linked to 1975 cold case murder, the headlines blared. The suspect, once shielded by privilege, now sat under harsh fluorescent lights in an interrogation room. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he barely knew Roseann, that they had chatted at the bar but nothing more. But when detectives slid the photographs across the table, the one grainy, the other clear, his eyes flickered. That flicker was enough. Then they played the digitized cassettes. The voices of detectives from 1975 filled the room. We had a strong suspect, but we can't touch him. His father would ruin us." His jaw tightened. Another tape played. She shouldn't have left the bar with him. What did she expect? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Finally, they revealed the DNA match. Partial, yes, but undeniable in its familial link. Coupled with the photograph, the tapes, and the timing, it was a net tightening around him. His lawyer protested, "Of course. This is a witch hunt. You're trying to convict a man based on ancient gossip and contaminated evidence." But the suspect's silence in moments when the evidence was presented spoke louder than any denial. And then came the scandalous twist. During questioning, the suspect muttered something that froze the room. "You don't understand. They told me to keep quiet. They promised it would go away." "Who told you?" the detective pressed. The suspect stared at the wall. Finally, he said a name, one that shook Howard County politics to its core. A high-ranking official from the 1970s, long dead, but whose legacy still adorned public buildings and highways. According to the suspect, this official had orchestrated the cover-up, leaning on police, pressuring prosecutors, and ensuring the photo disappeared. It wasn't just murder. It was conspiracy. When the news broke, Howard County convulsed. The revelation that one of its revered political figures had suppressed justice to protect a friend's son ignited fury. Local papers ran scathing editorials. National outlets picked up the story. "Cold case cracked. 1975 murder exposes political cover-up." The courtroom became theater. Survivors of Roseann's family sat in the front row, clutching tissues, their faces etched with both rage and relief. The prosecution played the tapes for the jury. The words of long-dead detectives, preserved by a grieving mother on cheap cassette tape, echoed through the chamber. Jurors shifted uncomfortably as they heard officers laughing, dismissing, protecting. The defense tried to paint Roseann as reckless, as though her choices somehow excused what happened. That line of argument backfired spectacularly. The jury recoiled, the public seethed, and the family held their ground. Roseann was no longer just a forgotten victim. She was the embodiment of decades of injustice. As the trial dragged on, more skeletons rattled from the closet. Other women came forward, recalling unsettling encounters with the suspect in the 1970s. None had been murdered, but the pattern was unmistakable. He was a predator, and he had been protected. For the first time, the community saw clearly, this wasn't just one man's crime. It was a systems failure. By autumn 2024, the trial reached its climax. Prosecutors closed with the image of Roseann, her Polaroid smile frozen forever, the life she should have lived stolen in one brutal night. They reminded the jury that justice delayed was still justice, and that silence could no longer shield the guilty. When the verdict came, it was unanimous, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Some wept. Others shouted in triumph. The suspect, once untouchable, sat slumped in his chair, a lifetime of arrogance collapsing into defeat. But even as justice was delivered, controversy lingered. The county faced a reckoning over its past, the officials who had looked away, the detectives who had folded under pressure, the politicians who had shielded the powerful. Streets named after the dead councilman were defaced overnight. Monuments were vandalized. Howard County could no longer hide from its own reflection. For the Sturtz family, the verdict was bittersweet. They had waited nearly 50 years for this moment. They had endured silence, dismissal, and ridicule. And now, finally, Roseann had her day in court. She was more than a victim, her sister told reporters. She was our Roseann. And they tried to erase her. But she's still here. The case became a cautionary tale across the nation. Not just about the dangers of power and privilege, but about the persistence of memory. A mother's cassettes, dismissed as obsessive, had outlived everyone and everything. They had brought the truth back to life. And in the end, the final nail in the coffin was not DNA or technology or politics. It was the simple, stubborn voice of a grieving mother, captured on tape, refusing to let the world forget. The courthouse steps in Howard County had seen their share of drama, but nothing like the fall of 2024. Crowds gathered daily during the trial, some chanting Roseann Sturtz's name, others insisting that the accused was the victim of a political witch hunt. When the guilty verdict was read, the courthouse plaza erupted with cheers, tears, and disbelief. For many, it was justice decades overdue. For others, it was a scandal they wished had stayed buried. But verdicts don't erase history, they illuminate it. And in the weeks that followed, Howard County found itself staring at an uncomfortable mirror. Street signs bearing the councilman's name were vandalized, spray-painted with the words, "Cover Up" and "Blood on Your Hands." Debates raged at town halls about whether schools and buildings named after him should be stripped of their titles. Politicians who had once praised the man now scrambled to distance themselves from his legacy. "We cannot celebrate those who obstructed justice," one county councilwoman declared, her voice trembling with outrage. The tapes played a second life outside the courtroom. Digitized clips circulated online, shared by young activists and armchair detectives alike. One viral video featured the chilling line, "She shouldn't have left the bar with him. What did she expect?" The internet exploded with fury. "This is how women have always been blamed," one post read, amassing thousands of comments. Others drew parallels to modern cases of corruption, insisting the system hadn't changed nearly enough. And then came the scandal within the scandal. As journalists pored over newly released files, they uncovered memos from the late 1970s that confirmed suspicions long whispered. Prosecutors had intentionally shelved the case under pressure from community leaders. One memo even used the phrase, "not in the county's best interest to pursue." That single line ignited outrage. For Roseann's family, it was a gut punch. They had been dismissed not because of lack of evidence, but because of political convenience. Howard County tried to heal, but the wound was raw. Old families who had known the suspect defended him, insisting the man who lived quietly for decades could not be a killer. Others, particularly women who had encountered his temper in the 1970s, stepped forward with stories of intimidation, harassment, and near violence. None of those stories reached murder, but together they painted a picture of a predator who had thrived in the shadows of privilege. For Roseann's family, the trial's end did not mean closure. Her sister told reporters, "There is no closure. There's only truth. And the truth is, she lost her life, and we lost her. Nothing brings her back." Yet there was also a sense of vindication. The tapes her mother had hoarded, the shoeboxes mocked by some as obsession, were now regarded as heroic. "Mom was right," her brother said at the press conference. "She knew they were lying to us. She refused to let them bury Roseann twice." The cassettes themselves became almost relics. The local historical society asked the family to donate them for preservation. Documentarians came calling, eager to tell the story of how a mother's stubborn grief outlasted a system determined to forget. Netflix sniffed around. So did HBO. For the first time, Roseann's name was known outside Howard County, her story resonating with those who had never heard of her but recognized the familiar pattern, the silencing of victims, the shielding of the powerful, the decades-long fight for truth. And in quieter moments, people asked harder questions. How many other Roseanns were there? How many other families were told to stop asking, to stop pushing, to stop recording? The Sturtz case was solved, but it cast doubt on countless unsolved murders across the country. The most haunting controversy came months later, when a retired officer, one of the very detectives captured on tape, granted a deathbed interview. His confession was simple, devastating: "We knew it was him. But the order came down. The councilman's boy was untouchable. If we pressed harder, we'd lose our jobs. Some of us would have lost more than that." He coughed, then added, "I still see her face sometimes. I should have done more." The admission confirmed what many had suspected all along: it wasn't just one man who killed Roseann. It was a community that chose silence over scandal. By the end of 2024, Howard County bore scars that would not fade quickly. The guilty man sat in prison, his family shattered, his legacy obliterated. Roseann's grave, once visited only by her siblings, became a site of pilgrimage. Strangers left flowers, letters, even cassette tapes as symbolic tributes. The story that began with a night at a bar, a missing photograph, and a grieving mother's cassettes had become something larger than one case. It was a parable about power, corruption, and the persistence of truth. It was a reminder that evidence doesn't vanish, it waits. That voices recorded in the dark can echo louder than any cover-up. And that no matter how many decades pass, the past always finds a way to speak. As one commentator wrote in the Baltimore Sun, the Sturtz case teaches us that time is not the enemy of justice. Silence is. And silence, as Howard County has learned, eventually breaks. Roseann Sturtz's name will never again be forgotten. Her story, once silenced, then whispered, then shouted, became eternal. Not just because of her death, but because of the truth that refused to stay buried. And somewhere, in the hiss and crackle of those old tapes, you can still hear her mother's voice, steady and unrelenting, "I will not let them forget her."